So a question I get asked often is, should I do all the specification papers? And my short answer is yes, do it for the sciences, not really for maths. And of course you'd ask, how many should I do? Should I take them seriously? Should I do them in the timed conditions? Why not for maths? And hopefully that'll be answered shortly. So I will be speaking mostly from experience in doing maths for maths, physics and chemistry, the new spec at A-level, and getting A stars in those subjects. I already made a video on how to make the most out of getting past papers, which should be linked in a card somewhere above. But your aim shouldn't be to copy exactly what I did. It should more to be get a few ideas and to take forwards into your revision strategies and whatnot. So this video will be split up into two parts, one for maths and further maths and one for physics and chemistry. The timestamps for those will be down in the description below. So for maths and further maths, for these subjects, I don't think I did more than maybe 2 or 3 old spec past papers, and that's mainly because the old specification papers were really structured in their questions, and you get caught up more in learning a method rather than actually learning the concepts and applying it to different situations, because for the old spec papers, they mostly just like change the numbers and change a few small things here and there, but it's largely the same every year. Whereas for the new spec, that's not really the case. The questions are much less structured and they're also harder and they like really test your understanding. But of course, it doesn't mean that the questions from all spec papers aren't useful at all. Whenever we learn something new in my maths and further maths class, my teacher used to pick out a good hard question from one of the all spec papers, especially for further maths, to help us consolidate that topic for when we learnt it. So I think picking out a few questions here and there for certain topics can be useful, especially those topics which you have learnt recently or are struggling with. But sitting down and doing a whole paper from start to finish, I don't think it's the best use of anyone's time. You can have a flick through some old specification papers and pick out questions which look quite hard and you might need some more practice on those topics. But remember that when you're doing these individual questions, if you choose to do them, that in the actual exam, it will be less structured. And because of that, what my teacher also did, she removed certain parts of the question to make it less structured for us and make it seem more like a new spec question. If you want to find some harder papers to do, I would recommend the old specification Solomon papers because their questions are harder and less structured. So I think they're more representative of the what a new spec exam will be like. Ultimately, ask your teachers for more harder questions and make the most out of any new specification papers you have, and watch my video on making the most of past papers. It should be linked above somewhere. But don't sit down and do a bunch of old specification papers. Instead, if you want to, just pick out a few questions here and there which seem worth doing, or even do the Solomon papers, and that should set you up pretty well alongside doing the actual new specification papers and the practice set papers are made by exam boards on the new spec and whatnot. So for chemistry and physics, I did every old specification past paper in which doing the paper and marking and making corrections and whatnot took about 2 hours in total for each paper. Would I say it was useful? Not really. I don't think it was that useful. I would only suggest doing a few of the old spec papers because you do notice they do tend to get quite repetitive, and I ended up skipping some questions just because I got bored of them and I had seen them so many times before. And the questions and topics tend to repeat every few years, and because of that, I think it's worth doing a few old spec papers just before the change. So maybe a few years, 3 or 4 or 5 years just before the change, depending on how much time you have. I would say in the case of AQA, doing the most recent papers just before the change to the new spec was helpful because I could see the questions beginning to change and get harder, and you also end up doing a question on mostly everything in the specification, because I heard somewhere that exam boards have to cover everything from the spec over the course of a few years within their exams, which is why you end up seeing a bit of repetition over the years. The most useful part about doing the old spec papers was learning what the mark scheme is looking for, rather than actually having to think hard about how I'm going to apply this concept, as was in the case of the new spec. Like doing these papers, I felt like I had an intuition for what kind of things the mark scheme, what kind of words they would be looking for, even when doing the new spec papers. But of course, this isn't really the case in maths, because they're not really looking for many words, are they? I didn't sit down for the full time in doing the paper, an old spec paper. I think it's better to do the new spec paper under timed conditions in the amount of time they gave you. But I think for the old spec, I found it got quite repetitive, and I was skipping questions which became quite easy or too repetitive, and I just subtracted that mark from the total mark and just marked it out of the questions I did do. I would say old spec and new spec papers, if your exam board does have multiple choice, then doing the old spec papers to develop your technique for maybe doing multiple choice faster or working on the timed conditions can be quite useful. For topic papers, when we had multiple choice, I found myself spending too long on certain multiple choice questions and telling myself like I almost had the answer, but I just ended up wasting more time. And I think practicing multiple choice using old spec papers, I learned to recognize when to cut my losses and just move on to the next question, rather than being stubborn and like trying to figure out this multiple choice for another mark, which may well take another 2-3 minutes. And of course, doing these multiple choice, you may find you develop some techniques to do some of them faster, especially in the case of physics and proportionality and whatnot for multiple choice. Also for chemistry, because me doing OCR, some topics were removed when it came onto new spec, and when I came across these questions in doing old specification papers, then I would just sort of ignore the question and mark it out of the questions I actually did do and whatnot, and then scale it up if I could. So ultimately, I think it's worth doing old spec papers for the few years before the specification has changed for physics and chemistry, but don't take them as seriously as the new ones. So now you may wonder, well, should I start off doing the old spec papers and then start doing the new spec papers? Or does it not matter? Or should I do new spec then old spec? And I think in the case of physics and chemistry, I did the old specification papers first, and I just did a few of them so I could get to grips with the content, and I knew which things I didn't understand too well before I made a start on the new specification papers. And so I could really make the most of these new spec papers. I knew which topics I had to learn better before making a solid attempt at the new spec questions because of the old spec papers. So I think doing a few can be useful just before the old spec, just before the new spec was introduced. As for maths, we just sort of did old spec papers during class, but I never made a real effort to sit down and do a whole paper. I would suggest if you want to do one, then you should do a Solomon paper rather than actually a old spec paper, or follow the advice I said previously about picking out questions from old spec papers instead. But of course, you still do the whole of the new spec paper in the case of maths, physics, and chemistry, and whatever other subjects. You sit down and do the whole paper because that's much more realistic, more representative of what your exam is going to be like. So that's it. If you want to watch any of my videos on how I got an A* in the subjects I did, then there should be a playlist linked above. Or if you want to watch the video about how I used past papers effectively, that should also be in the playlist. And if you found this video useful, then leave a like, subscribe to my channel, it really helps me out. And comment and suggest whatever videos you'd like to see in the future. But that's all for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.